So hello again and welcome back. I think we're ready now. I would like to take this moment to introduce Allison Taylor, who is the director at BSR. Allison leads BSR's energy and extractives practices and co-leads the sustainability management practice. She writes extensively about stakeholder issues and is going to share the latest news with us about the future of stakeholder engagement. A short Q&A will follow, so as we've been doing, write those questions down on those index cards and we will collect them. With that, Allison Taylor.
Hi everybody, good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here today. As discussed, the title of my presentation is The Future of Stakeholder Engagement. I'm really going to be talking about the findings from a big flagship report that BSR did last October. The structure of the presentation is I'm going to spend some time, first of all, framing the macro or mega trends that I think are really transforming how companies interact with the external environment and their own employees. And those, if anything, have accelerated since this report was written. And then I'm going to talk about 3 dimensions of innovation that we're seeing in terms of company practice and behavior. One around why companies are engaging with stakeholders, one around who they are engaging with, and then the depth of engagement. And then, as discussed, there'll be some time for Q&A at the end. But I wanted to start just by trying to provide a really big picture perspective on what the mega trends we think are driving this transformation in stakeholder engagement. They are transforming the corporate responsibility landscape, and they're also transforming how companies think about questions of ethics. I think so far in the world we've primarily seen ethics conflated with legal compliance, and I think we're seeing a lot of pressure on that, and to the discussion this morning about purpose, a lot of pressure from the public and stakeholders for companies to do more than say we comply with the law and we maximize stakeholder value, and to really promote and form their ethics and values. And I think this is coming about because of these 5 forces outlined on the slide. The first we're calling communication, connectivity, and hyper-transparency. And obviously, it's a bit ridiculous to stand up and say that the internet's a trend at this point. But I think it's easy to miss the degree to which internet and mobile phone access is still accelerating. At this point, we have 1/3 of the world has internet access, 2/3 have access to a mobile phone. And by 2020, there'll be 80 billion devices connected to the internet. And what we're seeing is a number of kind of implications of this. One is obviously the ability of what might have been small, localized challenges and problems to escalate into global reputational crises. I think we can probably all think of recent news stories and things that we've seen on our Twitter feed that would illustrate this point of a small problem can really spiral out of control. I was in Myanmar around a year ago, very emerging frontier market. A lot of local people in the area I was in protesting about a pipeline. The grievances were really about land acquisition and very local problems. But what was very interesting was that this conflict and this narrative was being picked up by global human rights NGOs and causing global reputational challenges for the funders of this pipeline. And there are many other examples, for example, around mining projects in Latin America, these agendas being adopted by global environmental justice groups and tied to this kind of wider narrative. And I think companies certainly experiencing this idea that transparency, timeliness, and accountability are really now standard operating principles, but really, I think, struggling to understand how to operationalize that and how to build trust and how to be transparent and authentic without undermining that. Another thing we're seeing is this sort of rise of large-scale data leaks and hacks. This started with WikiLeaks, with Snowden, with the Panama Papers, a ton of other kind of corporate leaks and hacks. This is all playing out in real time. And I think this is leading companies to think that they need to behave as if anything they say or do might become public. Because even if you have the best cybersecurity in the world, maybe your legal advisors don't. There have been a lot of leaks and hacks into major US corporate law firms, for example. So, what we're seeing is this need to respond to concern and pressure in real time. But I think it would be simplistic to argue that that's an easy thing for companies to do. And I would like to highlight in particular, I think there's often a conflict between transparency, particularly around the challenges that a company is facing, maybe about problems in its supply chain, intractable corruption issues, and the legal liability and what your chief risk officer and your general counsel will advise you to say. And very often that advice does not play very well with the public. And I think we're really seeing companies kind of struggle with this in this kind of real-time media environment. This trend is very tied to the next trend, which is we're calling individual empowerment and the rise of the middle class. Now, depending on how you measure it, the size of the middle class, particularly in the global south, is growing, and there's really been a giant reduction in poverty. We hear a lot about inequality at the moment, but this is rather a less reported story, that the size of the middle class, and I think what's happening is that there are people are increasingly focused on human rights and anti-corruption, the ability to have access to education and healthcare for their children, and increasingly holding their governance to account and being disappointed with what the governments can provide. And that is has immediate implications for companies. And I think this landscape about what the government is expected to do versus what corporates are expected to do, and holding that accountability in mind is really, really transformative. So expectations of business are rising, trust in business is collapsing, and I think the whole question of the relationship between business and its stakeholders is shifting. The next two trends, I think the first two are sort of fully playing out already. The next two, I think the effects are really only just starting. You can see them already, but I would expect these to really accelerate over the next 10 years or so. There's a demographic shift. The world is getting older, and at the same time, we're seeing this trend towards automation of business. So this is two trends in one, and if you think about the relationship between them, this seems like it may play out in a very, very interesting way. I'm not going to try and predict what will happen, but perhaps we will see business being able to provide far fewer direct employment opportunities just at the time when an aging population needs more social services, needs more social care, and is expecting, more. And so what you might see here is a very intense pressure on business to provide social services, to be have a more inclusive relationship with society. And I can picture that pressure becoming very, very intense because a company's tax obligations and normal corporate obligations won't be seen as enough anymore. The primacy of climate change and water resources is another area where I think things are really only just playing out. We've obviously had the announcement on the Paris Agreement last week. What was maybe underreported the same day was a lot of institutional shareholders talking to ExxonMobil and forcing them to disclose more about their climate risk exposure. We're seeing also a lot of tension about water. If you look at conflict maps in the Middle East, it's very interesting to see that where the conflict is really aligns with where water shortages are. So this relationship between companies and society around the control of natural resources, I think, is also going to get a lot more fraught and challenging. And then finally, we've really seen a supply chain oversight reach maturity. I think it's become increasingly difficult for companies to ignore what's going on in their supply chains. I think companies, many of them, are trying very, very hard to tackle intractable issues in their supply chains. We've had the Modern Slavery Act, for example, in the UK. But these are very, very difficult challenges, and it ties back to my first point that being transparent about what you're facing, about what might be happening 4 tiers down in your supply chain, This is something where the public may hold you accountable, and in fact, taking meaningful action and a common understanding of what good supply chain oversight looks like is really still evolving. So in conclusion, disruption is the new normal, and there is a need for more collaborative, inclusive, and strategic engagement with stakeholders. So we're seeing innovation, as I said, across 3 dimensions. I'm going to dive into each of these 3. We have some case studies, but there are many, many more in the report I mentioned if you're interested. So first of all, why a company would engage with its stakeholders. I think traditionally the idea is you have a stakeholder meeting once a year, you identify the top NGOs and civil society activists that might be criticizing you, the socially responsible investors, you get people in a room, you surface what you think, and that's your stakeholder engagement exercise for the year. The idea is that you engage stakeholders to, you consult them on their perceptions, and it's really a risk management effort, or for more advanced companies, an attempt to secure the social license to operate, which is a term that comes from oil and gas and mining and is spreading out into other sectors such as agriculture and consumer. But now we're seeing the purpose of stakeholder engagement moving more towards innovation and collaboration, either in terms of strategic progress or in terms of trying to solve really intractable systemic dilemmas. So for example, BSR has a maritime anti-corruption network, which is a collection of 80 shipping companies which get together to tackle problems of corruption and facilitation payments and human rights abuses in ports around the world. Another example that we have here, Orange, which is the French telecoms company, has moved into Africa, has almost half of its 250 million customers in 20 African countries, and as a result has tried to understand what those consumers want and what its options are for really transformative change. So it's launched this subgroup, Orange for Development, which is a strategy house designed specifically to expand the company's innovation capacity while partnering with a wide range of stakeholder groups across Africa to co-create new products and services. And given the transformative power of mobile applications to transform African society in key sectors such as education, agriculture, financial services, just access to information, this approach that the idea you'll have a better strategy if you consult your external stakeholders and work with them, I think is super impactful and really drives creativity and innovation. We also did some work with Western Union a few years ago where we helped them create new education approaches by these large stakeholder dialogues with a lot of different groups to understand what they thought and what their priorities were. So this is really a new thinking about stakeholder engagement, that it's not just about we want to hear what you're saying so we can manage our risk and design our message. It's really become more strategic and more core to the company's function. So that's one area of innovation. The next, I'm going to skip through this slide in the interest of time. The next idea is about who the company engages. Classic stakeholder engagement, you look at the impact of the stakeholders to influence your business, what they're saying, their influence, and you select stakeholders as representatives from constituent voices. So two things we're seeing here. We're seeing some companies taking a more system-centric approach, so thinking about themselves rather than the center of a hub as one of the actors in an environment. So the goal is really to understand not just the relationship between you and your stakeholder, but also the relationships that your stakeholders may have with each other and how that may surface other risks and dialogues. So for example, does the community group you're working with have very strong relationships with local politicians, and how is that going to affect your social license to operate? So thinking more about yourself in the wider system and understanding where you fit and designing strategies around that. Another area here is around broadening the definition of who your stakeholders are to include more non-traditional voices, marginalized populations, youth, women, and the poor. And this is really taking a human rights lens and understanding that we need to have greater accountability and a greater understanding of our impact on society. So it's becoming increasingly possible to trace your supply chain, to understand your impact, to record it, and Disney's been one of the first to jump on this and have this initiative to protect labour rights. They've put in place applications so they can get direct input from their supply chain workers through a mobile phone survey technology that's anonymous. And they're directly seeking input about factory conditions, and they're given access to this unfiltered data directly from workers so that they can respond to these challenges in real time. We recently held a convening at BSR with a number of consumer products companies on this question of worker voice. So this is very, very much top of mind. And when you think that supply chains will be fully traceable probably within 10 years, I think this is becoming less of a nice to have and much more essential. So companies, in summary, can employ this more systems thinking approach for more inclusive engagement, develop social media and technology strategies with communities' input, explore new rights-based business models in which communities play a greater role, including shared ownership and accountability. That's really been pioneered by the mining and agricultural sectors, but I would think this will move across the private sector over the next 5 to 10 years. It's important to include, of course, community decision-making and ownership in these conversations. And then finally, wanted to look at the level of engagement. I think this is another challenge. Stakeholder engagement is somewhere that doesn't necessarily sit neatly in a certain function. Of course, your employees are themselves stakeholders, and how the company shows up in general is this very kind of wide strategic question. So you really need to think about engagement in terms of who you're talking to at the market, regional, and headquarter levels, bearing in mind my first point, that the connection between the global and the local is getting much, much tighter. And so this idea here that stakeholder trust and engagement is a critical component of corporate value, increasing efforts to measure this, to measure the value of social risk on the bottom line, to measure the value of stakeholder trust. So this is not just a nice to have, we feel like we should do it, but we're not really sure why. There's increasing data that allows you to understand and value that. And it generally indicates, by the way, that stakeholder trust is worth about 30% of a company's value, which is quite a lot. So a good example here is from Rio Tinto, who, they're a mining company, so stakeholder engagement tends to be top of mind, and also stakeholders in a mining community are quite easy to understand and identify. But I think it's really indicative of how much Rio Tinto really prioritizes this issue. It launched and runs a stakeholder engagement academy where it gets senior managers in a room for a 4-day course of classroom-based theory, group work, role-playing and simulations. That is a huge investment of time and money. And the idea is really to provide employees across the organization with really best practice stakeholder engagement skill sets. So I think, again, this model's needed. This model you will see more and more. And this model, if rolled out, is also very, very supportive of creating a more ethical, values-based culture. So, I think it's important, though it may seem overwhelming, to consider every interaction that employees and managers have with external stakeholders, and also that your internal CSR team has with the rest of your organization, and really develop engagement plans that account for the whole organization and ensure that the company has feedback mechanisms to capture these grievances and opinions. I think this is about moving away beyond stakeholder engagement for its own sake, and really understanding stakeholder engagement is something that can drive strategy and manage risk, promote reputation, but really embed these concepts that we're talking about this morning of transparency, trust, credibility, and integrity. So I'm going to stop there just with this final quote from the 7th generation. Considering the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations and over the long term. And I hope that was useful, and I hope some of you will read our report and send us some feedback. Thank you. So I have a question here. Thinking about engagement opportunities like non-financial materiality assessments, what's the ideal frequency and type of engagement with stakeholders you'd recommend? That's a great question. We have in the public domain a report called the 5 Stages of Stakeholder Engagement, or 5 Steps, I forget which really outlines what we think is the methodology to understanding and mapping your stakeholders and understanding, how to engage. But I think first of all, you need to understand who your stakeholders are. You need to understand their agendas. You need to understand where and whether they conflict. And then you need to understand how to communicate with them, and that communication needs to be interactive. However, to my first point, it's probably no longer enough to do this once a year. There is a need to respond in real time, and there's a need to take those conversations beyond PR and communications, and to really respond to them, respond to the feedback, and be seen to be doing something if you want to maintain public trust. So I think the question of frequency and type depends on the nature of the business and the region and the industry, but I think it's becoming more frequent, and the challenge, I think, for companies is to be nimble and responsive enough that they can do that and still carry on with their core business. But happy to talk to whoever asked this question offline later as well. Another question, how can cash-strapped, budgetary restricted companies get non-traditional stakeholders to provide input to a stakeholder engagement process? Well, I think the easiest way is if stakeholders perceive that you impact them and they impact you. And I think the question about companies being cash-strapped and budgetary restricted, there's something interesting embedded in there, because it implies that stakeholder engagement and inclusive engagement is just a cost center. And I think we would argue rather that if this is done well, this will not only reduce your risk, but it will enhance your value. And so I think the first step is to kind of get maturity for these efforts about valuing these social risk efforts and valuing these stakeholder engagements efforts, so people can see how they impact the bottom line. I think beyond that, it's really a methodology point of view. Antofagasta, the Chilean mining company, has a very interesting model around one of its mines where it's not putting itself at the center of this dialogue. It's one of the actors with a load of community and political groups deciding how its CSR budget is spent in this region. So bringing people to the table and giving them a stake in what you're saying is really, really kind of critical here. I think that in agriculture, we're actually seeing much of the innovation take place here. So this is not just purely an extractives issue anymore. We are seeing companies such as Monsanto doing a lot of work here to understand and engage with their stakeholders, and also a lot of consumer products companies. But I think certainly stakeholder engagement is more challenging in these industries, because just even defining who your stakeholders are and where to pay attention is quite a complex exercise and needs to be carefully thought through. And I'll just take this last question because we just have a few minutes left. Speak to the disconnect between ESG and CSR for leaders in CSR and how to bridge that gap. The one of the problems with the CSR field is it's very, very jargon heavy. If you talk to people outside it, people are like, well, what is CSR and what's sustainability? And my excuse for this always is that the CSR and sustainability are where innovation sits. We're trying to identify the problems and societal challenges that are emerging for companies and capture and frame them. When they have emerged, they tend to become compliance problems. So I think a lot of the jargon and definition is around the fact that this is a very fast-moving and evolving issue. So ESG is thought of by investors. It's about managing and measuring your environmental, social, and governance risk. CSR is traditionally thought of as being a sort of philanthropic or outreach program by corporates. So I think ESG is really powerful because it speaks to this idea of valuing these efforts, valuing what companies are doing, beyond the kind of short-term quarterly reporting. Where I think ESG runs into challenges is, well, there are many challenges. It's very difficult to compare company performance across issues because the risk landscape faced by companies can really vary. And then I think what you will hear from companies is that they are getting punished very often for mismanaging ESG risk and not getting rewarded for what they're doing right. So I think where ESG is still falling down is it's still thought of as being a risk management compliance exercise. We'll look at whether you followed these environmental laws and we'll make a judgment based on your management capacity. And it's not going far enough to identify the impact and opportunities for innovation presented by ESG. And I think the purpose of ESG due diligence and how that interacts is part of the reason for that. But very complex area, very much an emerging area. I think we have the business case at this point, both for ESG and CSR, but implementing these strategies is still a very profound practical challenge. One more. How to motivate the companies who don't start the CSR activities. How can they win, how much benefit they'll get, or how can they win public confidence? I mean, I'm just going to go back to this idea of we all need to move beyond this idea of this being a cost center. But to the panel discussion this morning about Etsy and the market response, there was quite a good article in the New Yorker this weekend about, you know, is corporate responsibility still being punished by the market, etc. So I think this tension between short-term quarterly reporting and demands of shareholders and then the longer-term needs of stakeholders needs to be acknowledged, and companies need to work through it. And they really, I would argue, need to make a definitive statement that longer-term growth and survival is more important than short-term quarterly expectations, and stand by that. You probably all know that the Fortune 500 turns over incredibly, but that is accelerating. More companies, big companies, are going out of business than ever. And I think this is partly a lack of responsiveness to stakeholder opinion and partly a lack of responsiveness to trust. And so if you take this rather longer time horizon, again, I think the business case is really clear. So I would start with the business case to this question about where to start with CSR, and I would start with the issues that are most material to your overall strategy, this concept of shared value, and then I would take it from there. I hope that's a good point to start. Thank you.
Wow, excellent, excellent. You know, so we've gone from navigating engagement this morning, again, springing from trust and transparency, to the panel, which talked about trends of what's going on the ground, to engagement and how it's changing and how it needs to be viewed now and what happens if you're not. Lots of churn, as we heard.